Back in April 1814, Europe had been largely controlled by one man for about 10 years. This man was Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France. He was brilliant at leading armies, and under him, France had conquered a huge empire across the continent. But eventually, a large group of countries, his enemies working together, finally defeated him. This group was called the Coalition. Because he was defeated, Napoleon had to give up his position as emperor. He was sent away to live on a small island called Elba. While he was gone, the old type of kings, the Bourbon monarchy, was brought back to France. The new king was Louis XVIII, who was quite a large man. But soon, news started reaching Napoleon on Elba. People whispered that France might want him back. The French people weren't very happy with the new king and the rich people around him, the same kind of people whose bad behavior had led to the French Revolution 25 years earlier. Napoleon also found out that his enemies, who were meeting at the Congress of Vienna to decide Europe's future, were arguing a lot among themselves. Seeing his chance, Napoleon decided to do something bold. After only 10 months away on Elba, he sailed back to France. When soldiers were sent to capture him, they decided to join him instead. Soon, much of France supported his return. When the leaders of the coalition countries in Vienna heard Napoleon was back, they quickly stopped their arguments and agreed on one thing: Napoleon had to be stopped. They declared him an outlaw, like a criminal, and started getting their armies ready for war. Napoleon knew he had to act fast. He couldn't wait for all the coalition armies to gather and attack France together. His plan was to win a quick battle against the enemies he could reach easily. If he won fast, he hoped he could then make a peace deal while he was in a strong position. He decided to attack the coalition armies that were camped nearby in Belgium. These were the Prussian army, led by Prince Blücher, and an army made up of British, Dutch, and German soldiers, led by the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon's army was strong enough to fight either one of these armies by itself. But if Blücher and Wellington managed to join their armies together, Napoleon would be badly outnumbered. So, his main goal was to keep them apart and beat each army separately. Napoleon led his army across the border into Belgium, near a town called Charleroi. He wanted to push his army like a wedge between the Prussian and the Anglo-Allied armies. The next day, June 16th, Napoleon sent part of his army, led by Marshal Ney, to capture the important crossroads at Quatre Bras. There, Ney's soldiers fought against Wellington's army, which was still rushing to get into position. The Allied soldiers fought hard against several French attacks and just managed to hold on to the crossroads. On that very same day, Napoleon took his main force and attacked Blücher's Prussian army near a village called Ligny. This battle was a very tough and brutal fight, but in the end, the French won. Blücher, who was 72 years old, personally led a cavalry charge. His horse was shot and killed under him, and he was almost captured by the French. The Prussian army had to retreat, but they weren't completely broken. Napoleon sent another part of his army, under Marshal Grouchy, to chase the Prussians and keep them from joining Wellington. Then, Napoleon turned his full attention towards Wellington's army. Wellington didn't hear that Blücher had been defeated at Ligny until the next morning, June 17th. As soon as he found out, he ordered his army to retreat. They marched back in heavy rain showers to a position about 8 miles south of the city of Brussels, near a small village called Waterloo. Once he got there, Wellington received a promise from Blücher. The Prussians would march to help him the next morning. Because of this promise, Wellington decided he would stand his ground and fight Napoleon at Waterloo. Wellington had chosen his place to fight very carefully. His soldiers were positioned behind a gentle slope or ridge. This small hill would give them some protection from the French cannons. He also made his position stronger by using nearby buildings. His right side was protected by the farmhouse of Hougoumont. His center was based around the farm of La Haye-Sainte, and his left side was anchored by the farm of Papelotte. He put his best, most elite soldiers inside these farmhouses to defend them. Wellington knew his soldiers needed every bit of help they could get. His army was about the same size as Napoleon's, but it was a mixed group. It had British, Dutch, and German soldiers, and many of them had never fought in a battle before. Napoleon's army, on the other hand, was full of veterans, soldiers who had fought in many battles. Wellington's men would have to hold off Napoleon's attack until the Prussian reinforcements arrived. If they couldn't, they would likely lose the battle and probably the whole war. Sunday, June 18th, started as a bright, clear day. Napoleon had ordered Marshal Grouchy to follow the Prussians and keep them busy, while Napoleon himself planned to defeat Wellington's army at Waterloo and then march on to Brussels. But things didn't go as planned for Grouchy. He ended up getting stuck in a fight with the Prussian rear guard, the soldiers protecting the back of the retreating army, at a place called Wavre. Meanwhile, the main part of the Prussian army managed to get away from Grouchy and was already marching hard to help Wellington at Waterloo. Back at Waterloo, Napoleon waited a few hours before starting his attack. He wanted the ground, which was wet from the previous day's rain, to dry out a bit. Drier ground would make it easier for his cannons and soldiers to move around. But these lost hours would turn out to be very important later in the day. The Battle of Waterloo finally began around 11 o'clock in the morning. Napoleon first ordered a fake attack, or feint, against Wellington's right side at the farmhouse of Hougoumont. He hoped this would trick Wellington into sending his extra soldiers, reserves, over to Hougoumont. This would weaken Wellington's center, which was where Napoleon planned to make his main, real attack. But the British and German soldiers defending Hougoumont fought very hard and managed to hold on all day long. At one point, some French soldiers managed to break through the main gate, but the defenders quickly shut the gate behind them, trapping the French soldiers inside, where they were all killed. Wellington later said that successfully defending Hougoumont was the most important action that helped them win the battle. Around noon, about 80 French cannons started firing heavily on Wellington's main line of soldiers along the ridge. Even though most of Wellington's men were hiding just behind the top of the ridge, on the reverse slope, many cannonballs flew over the top and landed among them, causing terrible bloody damage in the Allied ranks. At 1:30 p.m., Napoleon sent his infantry, his foot soldiers, to attack the center of Wellington's line. The French soldiers marched forward in columns. They were met by well-aimed musket fire from the Allied soldiers, who then launched a charge with their heavy cavalry, soldiers on large horses. The French attack fell apart as Napoleon's men tried desperately to get away from the charging horses and slashing swords. Many French soldiers were cut down, and the British cavalry even captured two of the French Army's special flags, called Eagle Standards. But the British cavalry got carried away by their success. They charged too far forward, becoming spread out, and their horses got very tired. When they were most vulnerable and disorganized, French cavalry attacked them. The British heavy cavalry suffered terrible losses in this counterattack. Among those killed was their commander, Major General Sir William Ponsonby. Around 4 p.m., Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's commanders, thought he saw Wellington's army starting to retreat. Wanting to finish them off, he led a massive charge with thousands of French cavalrymen. But Ney was mistaken. The Allied infantry weren't retreating. They were ready. They had formed themselves into special hollow squares, with their bayonets pointing outwards. The French cavalry couldn't break into these square formations. The horsemen could only ride around the squares, getting shot at by the infantry inside, until they eventually had to pull back. Ney made a big mistake here, because he didn't send any infantry or cannons to support his cavalry charge. While this was happening, Blücher's Prussian soldiers had started to arrive on the battlefield. They attacked and captured the village of Plancenoit, which was on Napoleon's right side, his flank. This was dangerous for Napoleon, as it threatened his army from the side and rear. He was forced to send some of his valuable reserve soldiers to fight the Prussians and try to take Plancenoit back. Around 6 p.m., after fierce fighting, French infantry finally managed to capture the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, located in the center of Wellington's line. This was a major success for the French. It allowed them to bring their cannons forward and fire them at the Allied infantry squares from very close range. From this close distance, the cannons couldn't miss the tightly packed squares, and the number of Allied soldiers getting killed or wounded started to rise quickly. It started to look like Wellington's army might be completely destroyed right where they stood if they didn't retreat soon. But the situation was also becoming desperate for Napoleon. More and more Prussian soldiers were arriving on the battlefield, and he was running out of fresh soldiers to send against Wellington's weakening but still resisting army. So, Napoleon decided to use his final, most elite group of soldiers, the Imperial Guard. These were the best, most feared soldiers in Europe, veterans hardened by many battles. At 7:30 p.m., about 3,000 of these famous soldiers marched past their Emperor Napoleon. They crossed the battlefield, which was now covered with dead and wounded bodies, heading straight for the center of the Allied line. As the Imperial Guard advanced, Wellington's red-coated British soldiers, who had been lying down for protection, stood up to meet them. They fired waves of deadly musket shots into the ranks of the advancing guard. Then, the Allied soldiers fixed their bayonets onto their muskets and prepared to charge. Seeing this, the unbeatable Imperial Guard hesitated, then stopped, and finally turned around and retreated. This was a shocking sight. The Imperial Guard hardly ever retreated. Wellington, feeling that this was the moment of victory, waved his hat in the air and ordered his entire army to advance. At about the same time, the Prussian soldiers succeeded in capturing Plancenoit again. The news that the Imperial Guard had been defeated spread like wildfire through the French army. Rumors also spread that the Prussians were surrounding them. Panic broke out. The French army lost all order and began to run away from the battlefield in chaos. Only Napoleon's old guard, another part of his elite troops, kept their discipline. They formed squares and fought bravely to protect the retreat, facing certain death in a heroic last stand. Napoleon himself was forced to quickly leave his carriage and just barely managed to escape being captured by the chasing Prussian cavalry. The battle was won. Later that evening, the Duke of Wellington and Prince Blücher met near the inn where Napoleon had set up his headquarters. The inn was called La Belle Alliance, which means the Beautiful Alliance. Blücher thought this would be a perfect name for their shared victory. But Wellington preferred the name Waterloo, which sounded more English and was where his own headquarters had been. The Battle of Waterloo was, as the Duke of Wellington himself said, a damned near-run thing, meaning it was a very, very close battle that could easily have gone the other way. It was also incredibly bloody, one of the deadliest battles of that time. Around 50,000 men were killed or wounded in total, about 23,000 from the coalition side, Wellington's and Blücher's armies, and about 27,000 French soldiers. Because there was a terrible lack of doctors and medical care, many of the wounded soldiers were left lying in pain on the battlefield for several days. Napoleon was completely defeated. He couldn't raise another army. He eventually surrendered to the British. This time, they sent him to a second exile, much farther away, on a tiny, remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean called St. Helena. There was no chance of escape from there. He died on St. Helena 6 years later. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the beginning of a long period of relative peace in Europe. There were no major wars between the great European powers for the next 40 years. Great Britain would not fight another large war on the European continent for 100 years, until the summer of 1914, when World War I began. About 40 years after the battle, when the new art of photography was just beginning, someone took some remarkable pictures. These photos show veterans of Napoleon's armies. By then, they were all old men, in their 70s and 80s. Among them were men like Sergeant Tarja, who had been in the Imperial Guard, Monsieur Moret, from the 2nd Regiment of Hussars, a type of cavalry, and Monsieur Verland, from the 2nd Guard Lancers, another type of cavalry. Looking at the faces of these old soldiers provides an amazing and fascinating connection back to the incredible events that changed the course of history 2 centuries ago.